And we chose this title because very often in language teaching, the grammar lesson and the conversation class are seen as two completely different things which have very little connection with each other. Today we hope to show you how there are connections and that the connections between grammar and conversation are quite important. But let's start by looking at perhaps a traditional view of grammar, what grammar helps us to do. Now, grammar, just like any other thing in language, like vocabulary or intonation, grammar has meanings. And mostly the meanings that we concentrate on when we teach grammar are the meanings which help us to, for example, talk about time and place. So we have tenses and we have prepositions and ways of relating things in the world in time and place. Grammar enables us to say who does what. So a subject is different from an object. A subject does an action, an object receives it, and so on. And we have indirect objects and various other relations which tell us who or what is doing what to whom, and vice versa. Grammar also enables us to say what's necessary and possible and what's desirable. And in English, this is mostly done, of course, using modal verbs. So we have modal verbs to say what people must do, have to do, or ought to do, or need to do. Things that are possible, things that can happen, things that cannot happen, and things that are desirable, things that should happen or which should not happen. So these are very common meanings of grammar which we teach in the grammar class. And of course, grammar enables us to describe the world, if you like, to put words on our experience. So we have nouns by which we name the world. We have adjectives by which we describe the qualities of the world: big, small, yellow, blue, nice, horrible, etc. We have verbs which describe what we do or what we can do in the world, and so on. So that's fundamentally why we have different word classes: nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions, and so on. Grammar also enables us to say when, where, how, and why things happen. And this is principally done, of course, through adverbs. We have adverbs denoting time, yesterday, tomorrow. Adverbs denoting place, upstairs, outside. Adverbs denoting how, quickly, slowly, and why, giving reasons, adverbs of reasons. Intentionally, purposely, etc. Grammar enables us to ask questions. Obviously, in English, this is done with verbs like do and word order. We have negation. We're able to make something negative, the opposite of something that is positive or true. We can state conditions. We can say if something happens, or unless it happens, or provided that it happens, and so on. So these are the common concepts, if you like, the notions that we teach when we teach grammar. But of course, grammar doesn't only express notions, it also expresses important functions. And in conversation, some of the most important functions of grammar relate to the following. In conversation, we have to do certain things. It's not enough just to tell people where we went for our holidays or ask them where they're going for their holidays. It's not enough just to say what you did yesterday or what you're going to do tomorrow. In conversation, because we are always talking to somebody else, and that means either directly face-to-face or on the telephone or via chat or social media, these are the things that we have to do. We're going to focus on three of them. And the first and perhaps most important is you have to create and maintain a good relationship with the person you're talking to. If you don't, then the conversation either ends or it becomes an argument, a row, a quarrel, which is no longer, of course, a conversation. But we also have to keep other people's interest in what we're saying. Now, at the moment, I'm hoping that you are all interested in what I'm saying, but I have a lot of things like the slides and other supports here, visual supports in the slides, which I hope will make you continue to be interested and engaged. But when we're just talking to somebody, we have to find ways of maintaining that interest, and we're going to show you how grammar can play a role in that. Thirdly, we have to structure what we say. Now, of course, you're familiar with the term structure, grammatical structures, the present tense, the past tense, the word order of a question, etc. But here we mean something bigger. We mean that when we're having a conversation, we have to make it coherent. And a conversation is not a flat landscape where everything is of equal importance. We want to signal that some things are more important than others. We want to show that something is perhaps newsworthy, something that we really want the other person or persons to pay attention to. So these three concepts here are ways in which we create and maintain a good conversation, a successful conversation. And we're going to now look at some ways in which grammar plays a role in these three aims, these three goals of a conversation. And I'm now at this point going to hand over to Jeanne McCartan, who's going to show you one or two examples.
Hello everybody, I hope that this is clear enough. Let me know in the chat box if the sound isn't good enough. Okay, so I'm going to start off by looking at how speakers use tenses. We're familiar with teaching tenses, the present tense and the past tense. But we're going to look at something slightly different. And I should first of all say that I'm going to show you some examples of conversations and exchanges that come from a large database of conversations which Cambridge University Press collected over many years. And these are actual conversations which happened, and they were transcribed, written down, stored in a computer database, and we're able to analyse them, get access to them and look at them so that we can see what spoken English is really like. I'm going to show you first of all a conversation that was recorded in New York State about 10 years ago, and it's someone who recorded a conversation shopping in a store, and he's looking for a wedding present for a friend. And Mike and I are going to read the conversation. I'm going to be the clerk. Good afternoon. Is there anything I can help you find today?
Yes, I'm looking for a wedding present for a friend of mine.
Okay. Did you have anything in mind, or did you need some ideas?
Well, I have a sort of blank slate.
All right. Well, I can help you. Now, when we look at a conversation like that, we get rather excited, and I wonder if you can see why we get excited, or what we see of interest in a conversation like this. Now, if we were in the same room, I would ask you to answer the questions, but of course you can't, so you'll have to think the answers in your mind or talk to the person next to you if you're with a colleague. The thing that interests us about this is the following. The clerk says, Did you have anything in mind, or did you need some ideas? Now, what form is the clerk using? She's using a simple past tense verb. But is she talking about the past? Well, obviously not. She's talking about the present. So why does she choose to use the past tense in this situation? Well, she chooses it as a way of signalling.
So we apologies, we seem to have lost Jan and Mike temporarily. So my name is Helen Sandyford. I'm going to pick up temporarily to fill Jan's slot here and then continue on until we can get Jan and Mike back online. So picking up from where Jan was talking, she was showing you a conversation here that was collected from the Cambridge International Corpus. And as she was saying, one of the things that is most exciting to us is when we see this kind of use of grammar in a scenario where you may not otherwise have expected it. Did you have anything in mind, or did you need some ideas? So here the simple past tense is being used by this clerk in this everyday transactional conversation. And we look at this and we think, well, why is this clerk using the simple past tense in this scenario? And the reason for it is the clerk is wanting to use polite language. Let's have a look at some other examples. Here is an excerpt from the Corpus where a customer is talking to a travel agent, and the customer says, "We were wanting to book a trip to Sardinia." Not "we want to book a trip to Sardinia," which is perfectly fine grammatically, but here again using a past tense form. And also in a dry cleaners, what was the name? Here the scenario is the clerk in the dry cleaners asking the customer, what was the name? As in, what's your name? But again using simple past tense for politeness. So let's look at some teaching examples for this use of grammar in the simple past for politeness. Let's think about some of the scenarios or situations where you need to use polite language. We've already seen examples of customers asking for information in a store, for example, at the dry cleaners. And obviously those kinds of transactional situations often require us to use polite language. But in what other situations would we need to use polite language? Well, of course, when you're talking to someone where you want to be respectful, maybe where there's a different status in your relationship. For example, if you're talking to a teacher or to your boss or to a manager, you probably want to be polite if you are talking with strangers. You probably want to use polite language in business settings. For example, if you're doing a presentation. One time I was doing an activity with a group of students, and I was saying to them, where do you use polite language? When is a good time to use polite language? And my student said, you always want to use polite language when you want something from your parents, which if you're a parent, you will know that's a great idea. We all laughed about it, but it's certainly true when you're asking for a favor that it's a very good idea to use polite language. So let's have a look at a particular situation. The examples I'm going to give you here are from our material, from Touchstone and Viewpoint. As always, when you're presenting a conversation to your students, you probably want to do a quick warm-up to set the scenario, to set the context. And you can do that using the photographs and artwork that are provided in your textbooks. So obviously, a very straightforward activity here would be to look at the photograph and ask your student questions, or you could get them to work together in pairs and ask each other questions to find out and get the context of the conversation that they're going to see. So for example here, Who do you think these people are? Well, looking by the books on the bookshelf, it looks like she could be a biology teacher or professor, probably a teacher, professor, and that's probably one of her students. Where are they? Probably in her office. And now this question, why do you think the student went to her office? Maybe you can send in some ideas, you can type a few notes. Why do you think this student went to his professor's office? Maybe he's asking about homework. Maybe he wants to get an extension. Maybe he missed some work. Maybe he needs to miss a class because he's got an appointment, or he has to go to counseling or some other reason to miss class. Well, let's find out. So here is the conversation, and here you'll find the language that we were talking about earlier, this use of past tense for politeness in context. So let's find out why this student went to see his professor. I'm going to read out the conversation, and I want you to find the reason for the student's visit to the professor's office. And Jake says, "Excuse me, Professor Carlton, I was wondering if I could ask you something." "Sure, let me just finish up here." "All right, so what can I do for you?" "Well, I wanted to ask a favor, actually." "Okay." "I was wondering if you could write a reference for me. I've been applying for jobs and..." "Sure, do you have the information I need?" Yeah, but not with me. Would it be all right if I brought it tomorrow?" "All right, as long as you come late afternoon. I have classes all morning. When do you need it by?" "Well, I know it's short notice, but would it be okay if I picked it up next Monday?" "Okay, sure. So was that all?" "All right, well, see you tomorrow." So here we have the conversation, and we know now that the student needs a reference for a job that he's applying for. Now we know, of course, there are many ways to have students practice conversations, and you'll know all of those ways. You'll have tried them all in your classroom. And you can certainly do that with our conversations that we present in these C lessons. Students can practice these conversations in pairs, they can take turns. But these particular C lesson conversations, we want to do something much more specific. We want students to notice the language that is being used. And that's why we have what we call the notice boxes. So with each of our conversations, you would find a notice box like this. And you'll see that the notice box says, "Notice the expressions Jake uses to ask for a favor politely." These expressions are useful in formal situations or if you are asking someone for a big favor. Find examples in the conversation. So here we're having students do something very specific. They're not just practicing a conversation, they're actually looking at the conversation and analyzing it to find out examples of these expressions. And these expressions are, I was wondering if I or you could, I wanted to, would it be all right, okay with you if I picked it up, came back, etc. And these are examples of the past tense being used for politeness. And we also include in there the modal would. There are many ways of manipulating the grammar that you use to make your language more polite. But here, as you can see, we're focusing on the past tense. So let's look again at the conversation. And this time I want you to do a little activity. And this is an activity you can do with your students in the classroom. I'm going to read the conversation again, and I want you to raise your hand every time you hear the speaker using a past tense form to be polite. Okay, now obviously the only flaw with this activity in this scenario is I can't see you, so we're going to use the honor system. Raise your hand every time you hear the speakers using a past tense form to be polite. Excuse me, Professor Carlton, I was wondering if I could ask you something. Sure, let me just finish up here. All right, so what can I do for you? Now, did everybody raise their hands when he said, I was wondering if I could ask you something? Okay, that would be good. Then Jake says, well, I wanted to ask a favor, actually. Okay, I was wondering if you could write a reference for me. I've been applying for jobs and... Okay, did you raise your hands with, I wanted to ask a favor? And I was wondering if you could write? Okay, so here we've had an opportunity to let the students look at the conversation and find examples of the language that we're focusing on, of the grammar that we're teaching. And here you will see examples of the past tense form being used for politeness. Now, of course, once students have been able to see where the language and how the language is being used, we want them to be able to practice it in a controlled setting, in a controlled way. And this is actually part 2 that you can see on screen now. This is part 2 of the activity following the conversation. So firstly, we ask students to complete the favors with polite expressions. So you can see in there that number 1, students have written, I was wondering if I could miss the next class. And then number 2, there's a blank, get help with my homework. Number 3, blank, write me a letter of recommendation. So we want students to complete these sentences with expressions for politeness using a past tense form. Now, for example, in item 2, there is a grammatical element to this activity already. We certainly don't want students saying, I was wondering if you could get help with my homework. What we want students to write is, I was wondering if I could get help with my homework. So we ask students to complete these favors, and then part 2 of the activity is to match the explanations. So again, for example, number 1, I was wondering if I could miss class next week or miss the next class. I have to retake a math test that day. So for item 2, I was wondering if I could get help with my homework. So take a look at those explanations in the box on the right-hand side and find an explanation that matches. Which one would match? I'm seeing lots of you typing the correct answer. It is E. I don't understand the calculus problems. So here we have some very structured support for the students to practice. And then in section E, we're having students in pair work taking turns playing the roles of a student and professor, asking and responding to the favors above. And then, of course, in our teacher's material, in our teacher's edition, we give extension activities so students have an opportunity to role play further and maybe come up with ideas of their own. I'm now going to hand over, I believe, we have Jan and Mike back with us. So, Jan, I'm going to hand over and say, let's move on.
Thank you, Helen, and apologies to everyone. We just had a power cut in our village, and it took a little while to get our router to cooperate with us. It doesn't like sudden power cuts or power outages. Okay, so we talked earlier about how people strategically choose past tense verbs in order to create the effect of politeness or social distance or respect or tentativeness when they're talking to someone who is perhaps in a different position in a hierarchy, for example, a student and professor, or a customer and a sales clerk. Speakers strategically choose those past tenses. The present tense would be equally correct, but by using the past tense, they're signalling something in addition to time. They're signalling respect, they're signalling and creating the right kind of relationship. Before we look more at tenses, we'd like now to look at a different kind of relationship that people can create and maintain well, at the opposite extreme, if you like, from the student-professor, customer-clerk relationship. And I'm going to show you 2 pictures, 2 situations and 5 comments. And I'd like you to think and read them. Which comments are more likely to be from which situation, and how do you know? So we'll start with our familiar situation again, the student and the professor, situation number 1. And situation number 2, let me explain, are 2 friends, and the man is trying to hang a very large picture on the wall, and his friend, the woman, is trying to give him some help. Now, the comments are below, and I'd like you to think which comments are more likely. This is not a more black and white issue, but which are more likely to come from which situation. So the first 2, want some help? Second one, I was wondering if I could ask you something. C, I wanted to ask a favour. D, read my essay yet? E, you okay? Now, from our previous slides in this webinar, I think you'd probably all agree that B and C are more likely to come from situation 1, where the student is showing respect, politeness to the professor. But the friends don't need to show that kind of polite strategy to each other, and so they're using questions like, want some help? You okay? Read my essay yet? It would be very odd, wouldn't it, if the student in picture 1 said to his professor, read my essay yet? From a vocabulary point of view, you might think that that sentence could come from situation 1, but from a grammatical point of view, it would be very odd for a student to address their professor in that way. It's too informal. And what is it that makes that language informal? It's what we call ellipsis, and ellipsis is sometimes described as leaving words out. So, for example, if someone says, do you want some help? They're leaving out the auxiliary verb do and the pronoun you. So a more polite way of asking that, or a way of asking that to someone you don't know, a stranger, might be, do you want some help? Similarly, read my essay yet? The speaker is leaving out the auxiliary have, and again the pronoun you, have you read my essay yet? And you okay? The speaker is leaving out the verb are. And again, this is a way of showing informality, friendliness, friendship when you're speaking with someone that is your social or hierarchical or institutional equal. And this kind of ability to manipulate the formality of structures is very important for students, especially students who go to study within English-speaking institutions. I've often heard faculty and professors tell anecdotes about how students address them perhaps a bit too informally. For example, I want to talk to you, saying things like, will you read my essay, and so on. So being able to share with students more appropriate ways, these strategic ways of manipulating the grammar, is very, very useful. And it might not be the first thing that you teach students about, say, the past tense, or about questions and so on, that sort of past tense is used for politeness, or that when you ask questions you can leave out auxiliary verbs and pronouns. It's probably not what you teach students right at the beginning of their journey in English, but it's something that I think you can share with them as they begin to be familiar and can manipulate the structures for other uses. So let's move on again, because we're going to look at tenses. And remember, right at the beginning, before we had our power cut, Mike said that part of what we have to do in conversation is to create interest. We want to be interesting people when we talk to our friends. And so this is I'm going to show you a story that someone was telling a friend about her childhood. And it's a story about mud pies, and here are two children making mud pies. They're very, very muddy pies. But these are not the children in the story, but that's just to give you the context. So Lauren says, I was sitting out in the yard and my sister made me eat a mud pie, you know? And she's 18 years older than me. And I'm sitting out in the yard and she has all these mud pies. And she's all, Lauren, here, this is so good. I'm 2 years old, you know. Lauren, here, this is delicious, here. And she acted like she put some in her mouth. Again, is there something of interest in this story to you? Is there some way that this speaker is manipulating the verbs or the grammar? And as someone has pointed out already, and I'm going to go through this quickly because we're running out of time, Lauren uses the present tense in certain places, in key places. She's talking about the past, but she's using the present. I'm sitting out in the yard, and she has all these mud pies, and she's all, Lauren, this is so good. I'm 2 years old, you know. I mean, obviously she isn't 2 years old. She's a fully grown woman telling this story. But what's interesting about this conversation is she starts off with, I was sitting out in the yard and my sister made me eat a mud pie. So she starts with the past. She ends with the past. She acted like she put some in her mouth. But in the middle, she brings these key moments of the story to life by using a present tense. She makes it somehow real and in the here and now, as if she, as someone says here, as if she's describing a picture. She's painting a picture for the person she's speaking to. Helen. I'm going to pass on to her.
Thanks, Jan. So again, we present this kind of conversation in our material, and the example we're going to look at now is taken from Touchstone. And Again, we want to set a scenario. Here we have a picture, and we're going to look at a conversation where friends are recounting a story about a time that they got lost. So I want you first of all to think of some places where you can easily get lost. Maybe you can get lost when you're taking a hike. Maybe that's what these people are doing here. You can get lost in a city, maybe when you're driving to a new place. As some of my students always used to point out, you can get lost in English class fairly easily. So here we are. Yes, we have some people saying in a desert. Great ideas. Okay, so we have looked at a picture of where we want the scenario and the context to be. Here, students are hiking. And again, in our material, we always have a kind of warm-up activity to start the lesson. And here it says, think of a time when you got lost. What happened? And tell the class. Let me just mention something very quickly about these types of warm-up activities. Sometimes teachers say to us, my students can't think of things to say, or they're too embarrassed to tell their own stories. Well, here are a couple of remedies for those situations. Obviously, you can have students prepare out of class so that they're not sitting on the spot thinking of something. They can think of an idea and prepare 2 or 3 sentences at home. And then at the start of next class, they're already prepped and can share their story with another student or with the class. But you might say, well, my students never do their homework and they're probably not going to prep out of class. In that case, another remedy is to take the focus off the students, don't put them on the spot, and make this your story. So you, the teacher, have in mind a time of when you got lost, and then ask the students to take turns finding out about your story, about a time that you got lost. And they might ask you, where were you? Why were you lost? What happened? Students love quizzing their teachers, asking questions and trying to find out about them. So if you have those kind of scenarios where students are reluctant to speak, twist it around and put the focus on you, and you will certainly get the students talking, asking you questions to find out about a time when you got lost. So again, here's the conversation now, moving into the conversation. We listen. How did Matteo and Brian get lost? So we teach the conversation just as we did earlier. We have students listen. We have some general comprehension questions. And then, as we talked about earlier, we have students go back and look at the conversation and notice the language that is being used. And again, you'll see the notice box there saying how Matteo changes to the present tense at key moments in his story. It makes them more dramatic. So we want students to find examples in the conversation. And here is the conversation. So I want you to listen to the conversation and find out where the examples are, where the speaker uses simple present to highlight the key moments in this story. And Matteo says, remember that time we were hiking in Utah? When we got lost, that was funny. Why? What happened? We were on this trail and it was getting dark. Then Brian says, where are we? Yeah, we couldn't see a thing and we walked off the trail. It was that bad. Yeah, there were all these trees around us and we were so lost and we're thinking, oh no. And we're both kind of getting scared and we just wanted to get out of there. I bet. And Brian says, should we jog a little? And I go, yeah, I was thinking the same thing. Let's go. So we started jogging and we said to each other, we've got to stick together in case anything happens. So you may have noticed right at the beginning of the conversation there, first of all, Matteo says, then Brian says. He uses simple present. And we're thinking. Again, a use of present. And we're both kind of getting scared. And Brian says, and I go. And I'm sure you found out all of those examples. And then we have a guided practice. Here we want students to change the underlying verbs to the simple present or present continuous to make the story more dramatic. So you can do the first activity. All of a sudden, we heard this noise. So the speaker would change that to all of a sudden, we hear this noise. And I look over at him and I see his face is white and he's starting to run. Well, yeah, it was a weird noise. So I'm thinking, wait a minute, what happened to our plan to stick together? So and again here we have students change the starter to start. By the way, this is an actual true story. And again, we took this idea and this story from the Corpus, and a guided practice for students here. And I think moving along now, I think we're back to Jeanne and Mike.
Okay, so hello, it's Mike again, and once again apologies for the power cut here, which meant that we were offline for a while. We're going to finish by looking at focusing devices. This was the third type of grammar that I mentioned at the beginning. That is how we structure what we say in order to change it from being a flat landscape so that the listener, the person we're speaking to, knows what is important, what is newsworthy, etc. And we're going to have a look at sentences with what are called WH clefs. And here's an example. What we'd like to look at is sentences like this, which is another way of saying we would like to look at sentences like this. Okay, moving on to the next slide. We'll have a look at a corpus example here. Someone is talking about tidying their house, decluttering, throwing out things that they don't need anymore. And this speaker says, what I've got to remember is not to put things down and not to accumulate things, etc., etc. So this speaker, instead of just saying, I've got to remember not to put things down, says, what I've got to remember is not to put things down. And if we look at the way these WH clauses are used in English, whether it's in speaking or in writing, in fact, they always seem to focus on something important. I'm saying a number of things here, but the most important thing is that I have to remember not to do these following things. So it's what we call a focusing device. And we'll have a look at another couple of examples just to move on quickly. This is two students who are talking about learning French, and the first student says,
how do you usually study for a language test, or just study to learn the language?
What I'll do is I'll write the vocabulary. I like to write things down. So here we have, again, this WH cleft, which really focuses on this is the most important thing. This is the thing that I do very often. And we'll look at another couple of examples. I'm moving quickly because we want to give you time to address any questions or comments. This is someone talking about hotel reservations. Well, see, I called. What I did was I called them because, you know, Kev's too busy. So here we have both ways of saying the same thing. I called, which is the ordinary subject verb order, and what I did was I called. So the speaker really wants to emphasize that making that call was important. And similarly, the next example is someone giving advice on how to get to a museum, giving directions. What you need to do is take a taxi. So forget about walking. You really need to take a taxi. There are no buses or whatever. You are focusing on this is what is important. Okay, we've come to the end of the presentation here, and I want to now just summarize, and then I hope we'll have a little bit of time for some questions. What we tried to do in this webinar, and notice I've just used a what clause because I think these are the important points, is to show you how people use grammar. Firstly, to talk about the world, events and ideas, and then we also moved on then to the focus of this present webinar, which is to express interpersonal relationships, to create interest and engagement, and as I've just been trying to exemplify now, to focus on key information. Learning these strategic uses of grammar is part of learning a language. It's not enough just to learn the rules. Grammatical rules and grammatical structures exist for communicative purposes. They are not there just to punish and torment our students. They are not abstract sets of rules or commands. They have a meaning, just as words have a meaning, or just as intonation has a meaning, or just as body language has a meaning. And we are convinced, and we hope that in our materials we achieve this, we are convinced that we can help learners to actually acquire these skills of using grammar strategically. The problem for us is that students come to class thinking that grammar is all about using the rules correctly. But of course, we've tried to show you there are a number of different ways of being correct, and each of those different ways has different meanings and different implications for how successful your conversation will be. So, am I creating the right relationship? Am I showing respect or disrespect? Am I showing friendship or distance? Am I keeping my listener interested and engaged? Am I involving the listener in this drama, this story, or whatever it is I'm telling them? And finally, am I structuring my conversation in a way that makes sense, that shows to my listeners what I consider to be the important things and the less important things? We're going to stop there because we'd like to have some moments now for questions. Thank you very much for listening to us. We would also like to add that here are some of the bibliographical references for those of you who want to follow up these references, or you may be doing a master's course or some other course where reading is important. These are the references for the three areas that we've covered. Okay, I think I'll hand back now to our moderator, Simon, who might have some questions that he wants to put to us.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for that, and for seamlessly continuing while there's a small blip in the communication there. So thanks very much, everybody, for that. Do type in questions. We have a few minutes here. I'm just having a quick read through to see if there's anything. There was one question earlier, I think, from Lucia, which said basically about the corpus and where could we get further information on that, because I think some of the examples that we used were from the corpus.
Well, the Cambridge corpus is a corpus that Cambridge University Press uses for its own materials and its copyright, but there are a number of corpora on the web now which you can access freely. For example, the COCA, C-O-C-A, Corpus of Contemporary American, the British National Corpus. And if you're interested in the students' experience on campus, if they're going to study abroad or study in an English medium environment, there is the MICASE, M-I-C-A-S-E Corpus, Michigan Corpus of Academic Spoken English. There are learner corpora online too. So increasingly now, if you just search the web for corpora, you can find some very interesting corpora that you yourself can access and search.
Okay, thank you. Another question just seen there from Miss Hunt. It says, is it still necessary to teach students the basic grammar? Wouldn't this kind of moving around the tenses be confusing? What level can this technique be used at?
I think that obviously you have to grade materials, and I think what is a good idea is to make sure before you introduce too many uses and functions of this grammar, you have to make sure students are already familiar with the basics of the grammar. So for example, for the past tense, for politeness strategy, you'd want to make sure that they were comfortable with using the past tense, that they knew the forms, they knew how to form negative statements, they know how to form questions, that they're familiar with a good range of verbs. And so I think before you introduce this interpersonal function of the grammar, I think it's important that students know the basics and are comfortable and familiar with the grammar. And if you like, one way of looking at it is words have many different meanings, and we have no problem. We don't say, oh, it's confusing for students if we teach them too many meanings of a word, because words happen to have many different meanings, and we teach some meanings at the early levels, and we add meanings later on, and we add more meanings further up the levels. And it's the same with grammar. We teach the basic time function first, and then as we go up the levels, you can add in the more strategic interpersonal function.
And don't forget that this webinar is about finding links between the grammar class and the conversation class. Right at the beginning, I said that certainly in our view, they are often separated as if the two different classes had no connection. And this webinar has been about connections between the grammar lesson and the conversation class.
Any other questions?
Yeah, thank you very much for answering that. I'm just having a look through there are not, it's virtually time up, I'm afraid, as well. Just one last quick question that I've just seen here from Katerina. It says, when you use pictures in the classroom, would you take facial expressions and body language into consideration as well, or is that besides the point?
I think everything in a picture is useful. Of course, you can use body language because it can help you talk about a picture. It can help you set the context. So, you know, for example, in the people holding the picture, trying to hang the picture, it's a way of explaining to students what the context of that conversation is.
Yes.
So, yes.
And the student who is talking to his professor is not lounging in a chair with his feet on the table. He's standing respectfully, and that shows us something about the relationship. So pictures are important, yes.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, that's all the time we've got for today's webinar. Just again, like to thank all three presenters for today's webinar. Lots of positive comments coming through.